My name is Meredydd, and I am here to talk about writing good developer documentation. Because docs are always important, but writing documentation for developers is a little different to most software we are documenting. And I'm going to talk about some of the ways in which it's different, some of the roles that developer documentation fills for developers tools specifically. I'm going to talk about the types of documentation, how we can write them, how we can make them work together, and how our users can help us improve it. And throughout, I'm going to be talking a little bit about our experience building documentation at Anvil, the stack we use, and some of the choices we've made and mistakes we've learned along the way. But as we start this, it's reasonable to start by asking why we care about any of this. Well, I care because I'm one of the original creators of Anvil, the framework for building full-stack web applications entirely in Python. So that's Python end-to-end, Python running in the browser, Python running on the server, a Python user interface toolkit, and we have a company that makes development tools so you can use a drag and drop editor to build your user interfaces, don't need to mess with HTML and JavaScript, an online code editor for writing the Python that will run when you interact with those user interfaces, and of course the Python runs on the server, and a built-in deployment and hosting environment. So you don't need to know about DevOps or HTML or JavaScript. You can build and deploy a fully interactive web application, even if all you know is Python. So I'm obviously pretty keen on developers having a good and productive time with the platform I've built. And so should you be, because whether we are building a platform or a framework or an API or an open source project we're going to put up on GitHub and PyPI, we are building because we want what we built to get used. We want developers to find our project, to discover that it even exists. We want them to decide that it's useful, that it actually solves a problem that they have. And then we want them to be able to learn how to use it and solve the inevitable problems they will encounter along the way. And traditionally, we think of documentation in terms of these latter two. But especially for developers, documentation is important right the way through this whole process, because your docs are so much more than just a learning and debugging tool. For one thing, your docs are content marketing. If you are solving a problem that developers are really having out there in the wild right now, then out there in the wild right now is a developer opening up the magic oracular search box and typing in, how do I do exactly what your project does? And your docs are literally the answer to this question. And so you should be able to find it. Even once a developer has found your project, they do still need to decide that it's useful, that it solves a problem they have, which means they need to know what your project actually is. And sure, there are all sorts of things you could, abstract, pretty words you can put on a website to say that we're the best thing since sliced bread. But if you really want to understand a new project as a developer, you want to know what its sweet spot is, where its limitations are, what it can and can't do, whether it's actually going to be easy to use. Well, for that, the best place to check is the documentation. So for a new developer discovering your project for the first time, your docs define what your project is. So it's worth thinking about how your documentation comes across to someone who is just browsing. Think about just the table of contents. Does it actually provide a good overview of what your project is and what's it about and what it can do? Or is it one example of the common case and then 3 pages of weird edge cases that don't give anyone a good idea? The difference does matter. So here we have the table of contents of the Anvil manual. And I'm pretty proud of this. I think this is decent. We've got, the editor, user interfaces, client code, server code, storing data, deployment. That's a reasonable summary of what you can do with Anvil. And of course, I bring this up because we got it catastrophically wrong first time round. Because the first version of the Anvil documentation was structured to match our code base, which seemed like a sensible choice at the time. But in the Anvil code base, as it happens, things like the built-in database, that they are a service, is what we call it internally, one of these sort of plugin shaped objects, which meant that they were off in a folder next to the other plugins, like Google integration and so on. And so they were off in a corner of, and the documentation table of contents ended up looking like this. Introduction, editor, forms, modules, services, uplink. Like, what are these things? These are organizational entities that make sense within the code base, not within the user's mental model. And so this is a terrible table of contents for learning what the project does. So, lesson learned, we rebuilt our documentation deliberately so that the table of contents was an accurate summary of what you could do with it. Okay, so your developer has found your project, they've decided that it's useful. It's now time for them to sit down and learn how to use it and debug their problems. And of course, here, your documentation is going to get a real workout. And this is especially true for developer software, because software for developers is a little different to software used by most people. Most software is built kind of like a car. The user sits in the driving seat, they're looking at the dashboard or out of the window, and the manual is mostly forgotten in the glove box. Not so developer software. If somebody is using an API you've built, then that person is looking at their code and your docs, and that is it. So your docs are your user interface. And if you have the talent or resources, it is therefore probably worth thinking about in terms of UX. So here is the documentation homepage for Twilio, which is an API that allows you to control phone systems, so phone calls, text messages, that kind of thing. And you can see it's like a second homepage. It's got a little summary of what it's about, a little bit of code sample, because it is effectively a second homepage. To see this done even better, check out the docs for Stripe, which is API for driving payment and financial systems. And here, look at that. What have they got up front in the splash? They've got, they make it really clear what this project is. You write code, a credit card form appears. Bam. Scroll further down the page. Oh, look, they've got it broken up into the other things you can do with Stripe. They are effectively describing their product just through the table of contents of the documentation. And it looks good. So yes, worth putting the effort in, your docs or your user interface. So I've hopefully convinced you that your docs are possibly even more important than you already thought. But you can't just go to the docs store and ask for 5 kilograms of documentation, please. Docs are not, in fact, uniform things that you can just churn out. You do have to think about what you're writing. And in particular, you have to think about what type of documentation you're writing, because a tutorial is not the same as a reference manual. Now, thankfully, we don't have to reinvent the wheel here, because a very clever man by the name of Daniele Procida has already come up with a really neat framework for thinking about how your documentation works. So he divides documentation into tutorials. So those are the step-by-step guides that teach you how to use a product from scratch. Explanations, the discursive discussions of how and why your project works as it does. The how-to guides, the step-by-step guides to accomplishing a very specific real-world task. And then the reference, the dry but comprehensive description of everything it does. And I actually think Daniele would make a pretty good management consultant, because he's even got a little 2x2 matrix going on here. You've got the tutorials and explanations you use while you're studying versus the how-to guides and reference docs you use while you're actually writing code. And you've got the step-by-step tutorials and how-tos versus the more theoretical explanations and references. It's a really good framework. You can check out diataxis.fr to learn more about it. But I am inherently suspicious of anything that fits too neatly into a 2x2 matrix. And in this case, I think the biggest problem lies down here in the reference documentation. So if you dig into the description of this framework, you'll see that reference guides are supposed to be technical descriptions of the machinery and how to operate it. Well, okay, yes, that is good. We clearly need those. We also see that reference guides describe the software itself, APIs, classes, functions, and so on, and how to use them. Well, that's also a thing that we definitely need. But can one piece of documentation really fulfill both of these needs? I don't think so. I'm going to call this stuff reference documentation and this stuff API documentation, and they are not the same thing. To illustrate, let's imagine we're writing a library for unit testing. So like most unit testing libraries, it's got some idea of a fixture. So some code you run to set up the environment, and then you run the test itself, and then you run the teardown code afterwards. And really, to understand the machinery and how to operate it, you need to know how these components work together. It's no good understanding these things in isolation. You need to understand that you set up, then you test, then you tear down. It's telling a story. It's a pretty dry story, but it's a story. A, then B, then C, or A, therefore B, therefore C. And you need to understand it like that. Whereas API documentation is talking about individual code objects, a function, a class, a module. And therefore, everything you write in API documentation is about a code object. And so if you're writing API documentation for these, you're describing the setup decorator, the test decorator, the teardown decorator. And that doesn't leave you a lot of space to tell the story. If you want to tell this setup, test, teardown story, do you tell it in the docs for the setup decorator, for the test decorator, for the teardown decorator? Do you try and copy and paste it into all of these places? There's just no good place to convey this really important information. And if you make the mistake of trying to cram it all in, then you will end up with something I uncharitably call Javadoc disease. Now, this is somewhat uncharitable because Javadoc is awesome. It is the badass great-grandma of every modern API documentation system. It came out in 1997 as part of the official tooling for the Java language. And I mean, it genuinely changed the world. What it does is enable you to do something like this. So here, what I've got is a function definition. But before it, I've written this kind of structured comment with a little summary of what this function does and a machine readable description of the parameters, the return values, and so on. And then a program called Javadoc walks over your code base and parses these comments and the function definitions that follow and spits out clean, consistent, hyperlinked API documentation. It's amazing. It makes documentation so much easier. It makes it easier to write documentation because you're just commenting your code. It makes it easier to keep it up to date because when you change your code, the docs are right there next to it, which means you can update them in the same commit. And for these reasons, for a very long time, the average library written in Java was much better documented than almost anything else because they had the tooling support to make it really easy. So why am I using the phrase Javadoc disease? Well, the problem with Javadoc is all those comments you've seen, they're describing code objects. And it's because it's so easy to write this API documentation, it becomes a sort of victim of its own success. Because once it's so easy to write API documentation, it's very tempting not to write anything else. And so even today, if you look at a Java project, it's actually quite likely that all or most of the documentation of that project is going to be Javadoc, which is to say it's all going to be API docs. And here's what that looks like. This is the Javadoc for a library that does command line argument parsing. And actually, this is really good API documentation. It lists all the classes in this package. You can click through on any of them and find out what methods they have, what their attributes are, what will happen if you call them, what arguments it takes, what exceptions it might throw. It's really good. But there are things it doesn't say. So this is actually a pretty well-designed library. There is one of these classes is in fact this entry point. It does basically everything you need. You don't need to necessarily know all of these things to use the library. You just instantiate the entry point and get on with it. Which class is that? It's that one. Did you spot it? Of course you didn't. This is API documentation. There is no place to convey that important piece of information. So when we are thinking about our documentation, we should think about API docs and reference docs as two different categories of documentation. They're both important, but they are different. Reference docs describe systems, the machinery, and how to operate it. API documents describe code, a module, a function, a class. Reference docs tell a story. Setup, test, teardown. API docs stand alone because you should be able to consult the API documentation of the test decorator and find out what it does without having to read everything. Reference docs should be structured logically to match how a user is going to experience your project. But API docs should be structured like your code because they should be generated automatically. So story time. Here is how we got bitten by Javadoc disease, or actually the opposite of Javadoc disease in the Anvil documentation. This is, you don't expect you to read the text, this is a snapshot of the original Anvil documentation. And as I say, it's sort of the opposite of Javadoc disease. Instead of trying to cram everything into API documentation, we tried to cram everything into reference documentation, and it just doesn't work. So here is a section talking about sending email through the Gmail API. And it's trying to sort of convey how this works. It's trying to tell a story, which means it's trying not to stop and get bogged down in some automated or worse manual listing of every argument, every property of everything, which means it ends up containing this diagnostic sentence. Here is a more complex example illustrating all the possible parameters to this function. Translation. We are cramming everything into reference documentation. There is nowhere to put the important information of what the arguments are. So we're just shoving it in here sideways and hoping you can glean it. This is awful. This is awful. We did a big rewrite, and now there is reference documentation. So here's the section that's describing one of the UI components, or a couple of them, and it can highlight the important things. It can talk about how these things behave, and you can still follow the story through it without being distracted by pages and pages of the documentation for all of the properties of, let's say, a label component, most of which are inherited and shared with every other component, but by scrolling through them, it's impossible to follow your reference docs story. You don't have to do that. We can cover the story in the reference docs, but if you click through on any of those properties and events, you end up in the automatically generated API docs, which is uniform and covers absolutely everything, even the things that are covered with exactly the same description for every other component, because it should stand alone. You should be able to look it up. So yes, separating those out worked very well for us. Okay, so we've got these different types of documentation, and it's time to think about how they should work together. Because nobody's going to read your reference manual from beginning to end. I mean, heck, nobody's going to read your tutorials from beginning to end. People generally don't work like that. Instead, your user is on a journey through your documentation, looking for the things they need at every stage. So here's an example of one of those journeys. So a user starts out wondering what they should use to solve this problem they have. And they chance across a blog post saying, hey, this project's pretty great. So they go check it out, say, okay, well, how can I actually use it to solve my particular problem? Well, ideally, that's a job for a how-to guide. Okay, this how-to guide is spot on. It is how to solve their problem. They take this guide, they grab your project, they start implementing. Of course, they're not going to follow your project's how-to exactly. There are things they're going to want to need to change for their circumstances, and they're going to want to know, what arguments a particular function takes. Well, that's the job for the API docs. And you can see they've zoomed in from this very general talking about your project to the hyper specific. And this is a common journey. But here's another one. User starts, how do I do such and such? Well, they do what every developer does, which is to plug that question into Google. And let's say they land on a how-to guide. Remember, docs are content marketing. Well, they start reading through that. And this is all looking very good. But of course, it's a how-to guide. It has very prescriptive steps for a specific task. And it leaves them wondering how on earth this piece of machinery works. Well, that is a job for your reference docs. So a little bit of reading, a little bit of scrolling in their reference docs, and this developer is convinced. They've discovered this project exists, they're convinced it does solve their problems, it's time to learn it. Well, that's a job for a tutorial. And again, in this case, they're zooming out just as much as they're zooming in, because everybody is going to take their own journey through your documentation. And so the important thing is to enable them to take whatever journey it is they need. The simplest way to do this is, of course, hyperlinks. Link from everywhere to anywhere else that is relevant. When you're writing a how-to guide, you're not going to stop and describe each piece of machinery in full, but every time you use something, link to the reference for how it works and how to use it in full. When you're writing reference documentation, if you're talking about a topic for which there is a tutorial, link to the tutorial. It's possible your user really needs to zoom out at this point. And of course, reference and API docs are pretty symbiotic because every piece of machinery you're describing is going to be made up of code objects and interfaces. And you should always be able to click through and find out what arguments that function takes. And likewise, if you're in the API docs, you should be able to rapidly look up, okay, what larger piece of machinery is this code object part of? Of course, links aren't the only way to do this. Sometimes you can just put things next to each other. So here is another section from the Anvil manual. This is the table of contents of the section about user management. So Anvil has built-in user authentication for, so you don't have to implement login or SSO or all that stuff. Eli was talking about this earlier in the conference, in fact. And in this section, the pages within it, some of them are tutorials. Just right there next to it. We call them quick starts, but what they give you is a guide through using this subsystem and teaching it to you from scratch. And then the rest of these pages are reference. And now, to be very clear, each of these pages knows what it is. There is no page that's trying to be reference and tutorial at the same time, because that is going to be a disaster. You can't teach somebody from scratch and take them on a tour if you're having to be comprehensive about the behavior of every piece of machinery you touch. It's just going to be unreadable. And if you are explaining all these bits of machinery, you absolutely can't take someone on a coherent tour at the same time. But by putting them next to each other, we enable people to zoom in or zoom out just as they want. So, lots of different types of documentation. We have an idea of how they're going to work together. It's time to actually sit down and write them. Work out, what do I need most? What do I need next? Well, the best way to find the answer to those questions is to talk to your users. Because if you are talking to somebody who is using your project, you will know which parts they are confused about, which parts they don't understand. Now, obviously, it is really great and productive to do this in person. So here is my colleague Bridget helping a developer. Last time we could have a conference in person, which was PyCon US in 2019. I'm going to PyCon US next month in person finally, and I cannot wait. It's going to be so good. If anyone is there coming along, come find me. I'm the guy with a grin 3 miles wide because I'm seeing people again. But even when you can have in-person conferences, this is, not a very scalable thing to do. So of course you want to do some talking to your users online as well. We use Discourse, the forum software, but if you don't want to set something like this up, you can also use Stack Overflow, or of course, perhaps a Slack channel or a Discord instance. No, please Don't use Slack. Every conversation that happens in a Slack channel is locked behind the registration page. Nobody else can find it. And it's ephemeral. It scrolls away, it's gone tomorrow. And that is a real problem, because every time someone asks a question about your project, that's a bug report on your documentation. It was something they didn't understand. And if you answer that question somewhere public and searchable, that's a patch. And even better, because this process is driven by your users, driven by what your users are confused about, those patches will naturally gravitate to the holes in your documentation. It becomes sort of self-healing. Even better, if you're using a system like Discourse with its likes or Stack Overflow with its upvotes, then your users will help you decide which of these patches are most urgent to go upstream into your main documentation. Of course, not all of them will, and that's okay too. There will be a long tail of things that are too niche or too slightly off topic, but you still want to be available because they're helping users. But if your Q&A environment is somewhere public and searchable, then your Q&A becomes a sixth pillar of your documentation. Your docs become self-healing, and the long tail takes care of itself. So I've talked about the roles of documentation and the different types of documentation, how they can work together, how your users can help you improve it. And so I would like to finish this talk by getting a little bit more concrete and talking about our experiences trying to put this stuff into practice. So the main platform on which we deploy our documentation is, of course, our website, which is it's a static site generated with Hugo, which has ironically terrible documentation, but I actually do recommend it. It's worth slogging through the understanding. Hugo, by the way, is a perfect example of a project that has nothing but API documentation, which means it's impossible to find the story of how anything works together. It's a real sort of anti-pattern masterclass. But it's worth absorbing into your brain because it does enable you to do some flexible stuff, which we'll be touching on in a moment. Right, so tutorials. So these are, actually there's a section for this on our website. We actually divide our tutorials up. So rather than having one monster tutorial that's sort of indigestible, we have a getting started tutorial that is something that a developer can reasonably do in 15 minutes that gets them like the absolute essential basics. So, user code, client code, server code, describing user interfaces, deploying an app on the web. And then there's a whole bunch of sort of mini tutorials for the features that you may or may not be using. So for example, if you want to use that user authentication, well, there's a tutorial for that. If you want to generate PDFs, there's a tutorial for that, but you don't have to slog through it if you're just plotting graphs. Of course, not all the tutorials live on our website. It turns out, an awful lot of demand for video tutorials out there. So there are video versions of a lot of these tutorials, and hopefully more. This is a thing that I'm not a video person, so I was somewhat surprised by this, but it turns out that people really like having sort of video walkthroughs of things. And these tutorials also can be fairly easily adapted for in-person workshops. Again, can't wait for those to be a thing again. But again, once you've written a tutorial, it's actually often fairly easy to adapt it to different media, and well worth doing in our experience. The how-to guides are a little bit different. These live, again, mostly on our website, but they live in a few different places, mostly blog posts, actually. Here's an example from my colleague Ryan, a how-to for taking a notebook using Google Colab service and putting a web application front end on it. And this is like, when I talked about docs being content marketing, this is like prime territory for this. really an appreciable fraction of the people who sign up for Anvil every week for the free account come in via Google to pages like this because they are searching for answers to things we have how-to guides for. So these are great. But again, just on the website leaves a bunch of people out. So a lot of these things have, we have video tutorial versions of these. And again, these are actually relatively easy to generate once you already have the tutorial. The editing can be a bit of a pain. Doing a live stream is a way of getting away without doing the editing. It's often an hour's live stream is easier than editing together a 5-minute video. Your mileage may vary, but again, multimodal. The reference documentation, however, is a different kettle of fish. This is because it can't afford to be a bit bitty and ad hoc like the how-tos, and it's frankly bigger than the tutorials, and it needs to be structured and structured logically. So there is an entirely separate section of the site for the reference manual. This is again built with Hugo themes, a little bit of funniness to build this this hierarchical expander, but basically this is a hand-built website, which is exactly what you want, because again, reference documentation needs to be structured logically based on what your users want. So you don't want anything dictating the structure to you. Hand-built website is a good thing. The API docs, of course, are different again, because they absolutely should not be built by hand. They are automatically generated. So this one provides a little bit of a challenge for Anvil in particular, because it's an end-to-end framework. Anvil is actually implemented in a variety of languages. You've got like the front-end user interface components, which they interface with the Python code that's running in the browser, but because fundamentally they have to drive DOM nodes, they're implemented in JavaScript. And then you've got back-end APIs that are in Python, and portable stuff you can use for both the client and the server, which is also in Python. And so we need to be able to generate API docs from all of these things. So we did not use an off-the-shelf system like Javadoc. We actually ended up building our own. The simple elegance of Javadoc, this is not. So what you've got here is, so this is an excerpt from pdf.py, which is the module, Anvil.pdf, the module you'll import if you want to generate PDF documents with Anvil. And this is the render function that returns a PDF object. And you can see it's preceded by a funnily formatted comment that invokes the def function, and there's a bunch of parameters telling the API doc system what module this is part of, types it returns, what its arguments are, and bunches of JSON for documentation and cross-linking and so on. And this is actually consumed by a JavaScript program, a node program that walks across our code base, sucking these things up from wherever they are in whatever language. You can put these things into JavaScript comments as easily as Python comments, and rendering them into something machine readable that can then be processed by Hugo into something a little bit prettier, which is the API documentation section with your usual lists of all the classes and all the attributes and so on. Organized by module. Again, organized automatically based on how the code is organized, on how the modules are organized, not anything logical and human. That's for the reference docs. Of course, because once this stuff is machine readable, we could use exactly the same data to drive Anvil's in-app autocompleter. So you can see exactly the same documentation for the render form function appearing here live in the editor. If you want to know more about how this autocompleter works, then you want to come to PyCon US, where I will be talking about that. Going to plug that talk. Come see me there, it'll be fun. The most important thing for us here is, of course, that View Docs button, which is, it's a link through to the reference documentation for that covers this functionality. Again, it's all about the interlinking. It's about the ability to act as a quick reference of just this function if you're looking at just this function, or to zoom out and learn a little bit more about how the whole PDF machinery works, or at least how to use Finally, I'm going to talk about our Q&A. As I previously mentioned, we use Discourse for this. So it's open source, very actually remarkably easy to self-host forum software. I can definitely recommend it. But of course, this part especially is about more than just the software you're using. Because the important thing about an environment like this is that it's a community. You want to create a place where your users are happy to help you improve your documentation. And this requires a couple of things. One thing, you encourage them, you reward them. You want to make people very clear that you're happy about a thing. We have, and this isn't about crass things like monetary incentives, we have things like volunteer forum moderators, who not only obviously help us an awful lot with running the forum and answering questions and helping with user behavior, but it also provides an officially recognized role model of, oh, hey, these are the people that, that people want to be in this community. And of course, like the ingredient for all of this is to pay attention, because the biggest thing that's going to make somebody feel like participating in a Q&A community like this is a waste of time is if it's being left to wither on the vine. So we actually, very unsexily, we have a rota. So just to make sure that at least one of us at all times is keeping an eye on the forum, making sure that the community is working well, questions are getting answered, and people feel like they are being paid attention to, and that they are being valued. And if you do that, it is amazing how much people will help you improve your documentation. So I've talked to you about the different forms of documentation. I've talked to you about their roles, why they're important. I've talked to you about how these different types of documentation can work together, how our users can help us improve it, and I've walked you through our stack for implementing these ideas. So I want to leave you with the reminder that your docs are your user interface. Developers, if you're building for developers, they are looking at their code and your docs, and that's it. So make it worthwhile. Your docs are marketing. People out there are searching for the question to which you are the answer. Make sure that your docs are out there helping people. And your docs define what your project is to anybody who doesn't already know it, which is to say almost everybody in the world. So for heaven's sake, act like it. Especially if this is a commercial project and you are out there starving for attention, love, traction, whatever words you are using for it. Just remember that your documentation is important much earlier in the funnel than you might be thinking. And when you're writing your documentation, know what type of documentation you're writing. Tutorials are not the same thing as reference guides, and if you try to be both, you will fail. Remember that API docs and reference docs are different things. They're both important, but they are definitely different. And talk to your users, because they will help you fill in the gaps. Thank you very much.